The format starts with a 3-minute introduction that are in order based on a drawing of the candidates a few moments ago. We'll reverse that order for closing statements. Each of those will be 3 minutes. There are 10 questions that have been consolidated from questions submitted by the public. Our moderator will call out the names of a specific candidate who will answer the question with a 3-minute response. Then she will call on 2 other candidates by name to give a 1.5-minute rebuttal to the same question. The order of names the moderator is using is also based on a random drawing. None of the candidates know in advance what questions they will be answering. The moderator for this evening is Jill Nordgren, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at John Jay College and the PhD program in Political Science at the University of New York Graduate School and University Center. Jill, if you'd like to come up, that'd be great. We'd like to thank people who have helped organize this event, everything from the type of coffee to the questions that you'll be hearing and then some. Murray Johnson, who's the chair of the Beekman Democratic Party, Helen Grasso, who has chaired this debate committee, Barbara Walsh, Alfred Grev, Helen Grasso I mentioned, Tom Rose, who's vice chair of the Pawling Democrats and is doing the sound recording tonight, Lisa Kelsey, who designed the flyers that many of you saw, Walter Herkt, who's the videographer, Vinnie Grasso, who's a photographer and has been assisting greatly with the technical aspects, and Riley Curran, who's running the timer clock up in the front. Co-sponsors of tonight's debate are the Unionville Democrats with Chairman Bill McCabe, the Young Democrats, Chairman Frank Mazzella, Marco Caviglia, Chair of the LaGrange Democrats and also the Democratic Commissioner of the Board of Elections for Dutchess County, and Dustin Reedy, Campaign Director for 19 Votes. The candidates tonight will be introduced in a second. I should note that Patrick Ryan is unavailable tonight due to a long-standing commitment that we knew about several weeks ago. He's been visiting the area with Democratic committees and other events with a positive reception. His field director, Britt Bender, is here, and you can speak to her about volunteering for his campaign if you choose to. I'm now going to bring out the candidates to allow them to come up. You may applause at this point if you'd like to. Jeff Beals, David Clegg, Antonio Delgado, Brian Flynn, and Gareth Rhodes.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jill Nordgren. I'm a resident of Pawling, and I'm delighted to see so many people tonight. The night reminds me of a book my children used to read that somewhere had the lines, "It was a dark and stormy night." So thank you to you, and thank you to our 5 candidates. We'll begin, as Paul said, with 3-minute opening statements. Then we'll have the 10 questions, which are among the several dozen that you have submitted to us. And then we'll have 3-minute closing statements from each candidate. And after that, there's food over there, and we hope that you will join the candidates and further buzz them with your questions. So the first person to speak in the 3-minute opening will be Brian Flynn. Mr. Flynn.
Yeah, sure, stand. I was told to stop standing.
They told us that over there.
I'm not very good at following directions. Maybe that'll make me a good congressman, I don't know. First of all, I'd like to thank the number of people who were listed who helped put this all together. It's quite an impressive list. And I was going to try to memorize the Pawling, the Unionville, the Beekman Town committees, and all the people involved. But there's far too many people. But thank you all for everything that you've done and for putting this together. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It means a lot to all of us. You are our inspiration. As I travel around this district, what I hear a lot is that people don't recognize this country anymore. People say that they actually feel that democratic institutions and democracy itself is under attack. They see the rise of white nationalism. They see the threat of authoritarianism right here in America. They see friends of theirs who previously voted for Barack Obama are now voting for Donald Trump. So what's happened? How did we get to this point? Because Donald Trump isn't the cause, he's the result. So how did we get here? And I would say it's because for decades we've ignored the American worker and the economic pain and anxiety that they've been under. For decades, we've actually forgotten about our rural communities and small towns. For decades, we've paid women a fraction of what they're worth, and we've done worse by communities of color. And for decades, we've continued to marginalize and mistreat our immigrant and LGBTQ friends. And why? What's it all about? How did this happen? Since the 1980s, we've had incomes that have been stagnant and going down, yet the 1% has continued to gather up all the riches. And it's no accident. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can change this narrative together. And that's why I have a big, bold plan for the American worker. It starts with Medicare for all. And I've been advocating for that since 2004. It's investments that put us at the epicenter of the clean energy revolution. It's about criminal justice reform, not only so that we protect and defend everyone in our culture, but we also provide opportunities for everyone. It's also about investments in infrastructure. And it's policies and specific programs that enable and empower women in the workforce and stop this assault on the rights of women and girls. It's going to take a candidate who's a proven leader, someone that's actually gotten things done in Washington, who's created hundreds of blue-collar American jobs, and who knows what it means to lead. I look forward to your questions, and thank you so much for taking the time tonight.
All right, thank you. And now, speaking second will be Mr. Delgado.
Good evening. How's everybody doing out there?
All right.
All right, it's good to see you. This is democracy. Let's bottle this up here in 2018. We all know how important this year is, don't we? It is a critically important year, and I'm excited to be a part of it with you and do the work that we know is required now more than ever. So thank you. Now, I live in Rhinebeck with my wife, Lacey, and our two little boys, Maxwell and Coltrane, for the jazz fans in the room. They are 4, and they are boys, and all boys, so a handful. But my story begins in Schenectady, born and raised, working class family. My parents worked for GE for many years, and if you know much about the Hudson Valley, you know that GE and IBM employed a lot of folks during the late 70s up through the mid-90s. My generation, I'm 41, I would argue was the last generation to really benefit from that economic model, where thousands of families could work their way up, as my family did. My parents worked full-time every day. I was a latchkey kid. Homework was front and center every evening. They believed that in this country, with a good education, you can get ahead. It is the great equalizer, the gateway to opportunity. And yet here we are, 3 presidential debates some years later, and not a single question about education. What's happened to our future? Now, I grew up in a household where that was front and center, took that lesson with me to Colgate, studied philosophy, political theory, earned a Rhodes Scholarship. I can promise you when I was cutting coupons and putting clothes on layaway with my mother and my father in Schenectady, we weren't talking about me going to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. But there I was. I then came back home and got my law degree at Harvard. Met my wife there. By far the best part about that experience. She grew up only an hour apart from me in Woodstock. Parents, small business owners. We both lived good lives. But for the past 40 some odd years, a different story has happened. The economy has doubled in size. Wages have remained stagnant. 2/3 are living paycheck to paycheck. 80% of us are being asked to share 7% of the wealth, and it's because our leaders have stopped caring about the working families that I come from and my wife comes from, and like so many of yours. We have been left behind. And it's not just because of globalization, it's because of greed. It's because our government has been taken over by big corporations and the wealthy. And we need to change it. We need folks who will fight for jobs, meaning infrastructure, broadband, cell service. We need folks who will fight for universal health care for everyone. We need folks who will fight for universal pre-K for our children. We need folks who will fight to protect the environment, who will fight for our future. grounded in our values: compassion, service, love, character, integrity. This is who we are. And if there's no better time right now to remember that, thank you.
Mr. Delgado, thank you. Speaking third will be David Clegg.
I don't follow the rules normally, so I'm standing up. Hi, I'm Dave. Can you hear me? Is this good? I'm Dave Clegg. For the last 36 years, I've been serving and fighting for the people of this community. I would like to take that fight to Congress. We need a representative who will fight for working people, not for special interests, not for big corporations, and not for John Fasso's wealthy donor class. As a trial lawyer, I've taken on giant corporations like Walmart, holding them accountable for predatory conduct. Corporations that put profit over employees, who put profit over people. As a civil rights lawyer and activist, I've protected people and fought against people and stopped people who were discriminating against others because of their race or because of their sexual orientation or their gender. And as a human rights chair of Ulster County, I have worked to enforce and promote restorative justice throughout our county and our school system, and also to work to spread human rights and draft laws that protect us and expand our rights. As a small businessman, I've always paid people a fair living wage. I believe in that. Benefits and health care. I would fight for those things in Congress. And I've also represented many small businesses, from a trucking company up in Greene County to contractors down in Sullivan County. And I know small businessmen, and I can reach across the aisle and work with them because they are the engines of our economy. I've donated my time to this community in ways that are multiple. I've helped start the homeless shelter in Kingston, helped start Habitat for Humanity. I've donated hundreds of hours of time to women in the women's shelter. Now, why does this make me the best candidate and the only candidate that can beat John Faso? Because everything I'm talking about and everything that I'm running for are things that I've done, are things that I've acted on in my life, because those are the principles that I believe in. So what am I going to do? I'm going to represent you and fight for Medicare for all, because no one should have to choose between medical coverage and paying their rent. I'm going to fight for fair share taxes, because the rich should not be getting huge tax deductions on the backs of the working class. I'm going to fight for fair share taxes also to make sure that we are protecting Medicare and Medicaid and benefits that are earned over a lifetime. I'm going to do all those things and hold John Faso accountable, because John Faso is somebody who has watched and stood by mutely as Donald Trump attacks our democracy. And he has thrown us in the tube while he protects his wealthy donor class. So I'm here to represent you and build on the work that I've already done in this community. Thank you.
Paul likes his bill. Speaking fourth will be Gareth Rhodes.
Hello? Is this working? Can you hear me in the back?
Good.
Well, I tried to stand up, Dave, but I couldn't get the mic off the stand. But hope you forgive me. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Pawling Democrats. I frankly didn't know there were so many Democrats in Pawling, but it's great to see everyone here tonight. Tonight, we're all Democrats, and you're going to hear a lot of us talk about our views on the issues, which, as it will not surprise you, will be very similar. I want to talk a little bit about beating John Faso, because I think that's why we're here on a rainy night, is because we want to beat John Faso this coming November. And I believe that I give our party a real chance to beat John Faso for a few different reasons. First, my upbringing here in this community. Born and raised in NY19. I grew up across the river, grew up working on a farm in Ulster County. After I graduated from high school, I didn't go right to college, like many young people in upstate New York. I went out and got a job drilling water wells. So here in Pawling, if you have a water well in your backyard and you smell sulfur, give me a call. Happy to help you out. I joined my local fire department. I then working hard, became the first in my family to earn a 4-year college degree. But I believe that background, growing up in the community, working to put myself through college, will be something that a lot of the families here in upstate New York can relate to, As we know, this is a big, diverse district, and it's important to be able to go to every single part of this district and have appeal to not just Democrats, but voters of all stripes. Second, I am the only candidate on this stage who does have political government experience here in New York State. I had the privilege at a young age to get a job working up in Albany in the governor's office, where I traveled to every single county in the state. I was part of the administration that passed marriage equality. I was proud to be part of the administration that banned fracking here in New York State. I was proud to be part of the work in this community to help the small breweries and the farm-to-table movement, things that have created jobs here on the local level. Third, which I think is the most important one, is I'm running a completely different type of campaign. When you came in here, you may have seen my 1999 Ford Winnebago in the parking lot. I'm going to all 163 towns in this congressional district. This district is bigger than Rhode Island and Connecticut combined. Because we know this November, Faso and the Mercers and the Koch brothers are going to blanket our airwaves. You won't be able to go to your mailbox without seeing those nasty attack ads. We're going to need to have a candidate who has a presence in every single town in this district, who has the energy, the enthusiasm to show up and talk about why they love our community and what they're going to do to serve this community in Congress. And that's why John Faso and the National Republican Party has singled me out time and time again and attacked me, because they know that that background, that experience, and that approach will undoubtedly repeal and replace John Faso this November. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And now rounding out this portion of tonight's program, Jeff Beals will speak.
Thanks everybody for being here. It is a dark night, and it's a dark time in our country too. We have to defend our country against what I think we see now is the most vicious, corporate, militaristic, anti-union, anti-posterity government maybe in our history. And I have been motivated to stand up to face it down and stand up to John Faso, as of my friends here. I think our crisis is no less than that, and we have a congressman who is not up to it and is not standing up for us. I'm Jeff Beals. I'm a teacher in Woodstock. I teach high school history. My wife, Suhair, teaches kindergarten. My sons, Abraham and Joseph, go to school in Woodstock. But my story is the story of a life lived under the threat of democracy's fall and the hope of democracy's rise. Democracy fell in Europe, and that led to my grandparents and relatives all being rounded up in concentration camps. And I am the grandson of 4 Holocaust survivors who saw their lives and posterity consumed by that war. And they came to this country as refugees for a new start, believing in America. And they found, after working in factories and sweatshops in New York City, a piece of the American dream here in our district, in Sullivan County, in the old Borscht Belt, in places like Liberty and South Fallsburg. My dad and my mother spent a great part of their childhood there. My dad worked waiting tables in Ellenville, and then went on to build our family farm in the Hudson Valley in Putnam County, not far from here. And we've raised livestock there over the years. And I grew up going to schools in Westchester, working on our family's farm, and dreaming about how I could give back to the country that saved my family. And I started my career as a CIA intelligence officer under the Clinton administration. I worked for peace in the Middle East there, trying to promote and inform policy, briefing congressmen and senators. And I went on, after frustrations there, to play a more direct role in our foreign policy, and I became commissioned as a U.S. Foreign Service officer. And I was a diplomat in the West Bank and Gaza Strip with my close friend Chris Stevens, who we lost in Benghazi. About a year into the Iraq War, I was called out there to try to help our country find a way out. I answered that call, and I was decorated by the Army and the State Department for my service there. But I came back to find an America in crisis, and democracy, which I had thought was something we needed to fight for overseas, I now believe is something we have to fight for here. That's why I'm running, to fight that fight and to stand up for democracy that is now threatened greatly by an overwhelming tide of corporate power that has erased people power. I believe that we can stand up and revive our Democratic Party by standing for the greatest, most ancient ideals of this party. Medicare for all, women's rights, pro-choice, no questions and no excuses. Standing up to corporations so that they pay their fair share, standing up for sensible gun laws at a time of domestic threat, and standing up for the people against the forces arrayed against them. I hope you'll join me. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, if you recall from what Paul said, This next portion of our program involves 10 questions. Again, 10 out of many, so some of you will be disappointed. You'll have to wait to ask your questions individually in the meet and greet. The person that I call on first will have 3 minutes to speak, and then there will be 2 other people speaking to that particular question, and they will each have 1.5 minutes. So the first question goes to Mr. Clegg, and this is what it is. President Obama and many Democrats supported a corporate tax rate reduction in 2012. What is your view of the recent reduction in corporate taxes and other aspects of that tax bill?
We gave $1.5 trillion away to the ultra-rich and big corporations. This tax bill is regressive in many ways. You know that the corporate deductions are permanent, and the deductions for the working people are going to end in 2026. The tax bill is going to put us in a place where we are going to have to challenge the benefits that we have from Social Security and Medicare. They're going to use the deficits. Actually, John Faso was down at our Chamber of Commerce. He's already talking about deficits. A month after they gave away $1.5 trillion to tax deductions to the wealthiest corporations in the world, corporations that didn't deserve it, didn't need it, were taking away the ability to invest in infrastructure. All of a sudden, we go from $1 trillion we're going to spend on infrastructure that are needed for our roads, for our bridges, and for our broadband throughout this area. All those opportunities that we had to create jobs, to invest in education, all those things are going to be taken away because of deficits that are created by tax deductions for corporations. We had corporations that had put money in Ireland and other places, $250 billion, I think, by Apple. They didn't bring it back. They were waiting for the Republicans to give them an unjustified tax deduction. That is wrong. We should be investing in people. We need a fair share tax system. Back in 1952, corporations paid over 30% of our tax burden. Right now, they're paying less than 10%. We have the corporate ear only with Congress. That's the only people they're listening to. We have the best Congress that money can buy in that respect. Corporations have taken over our government. Corporations are what John Faso lobbies for. He was a corporate lobbyist. He continues to be a corporate lobbyist. We need to change John Faso. We need to change the Republican Congress. We need to get our country back. We need to protect the working family against the corporations. Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Beals has 1.5 minutes to comment or rebut on that question.
I couldn't agree more. Look, while we have a situation now in our country where we all in our communities here face a tremendous strain on working people, and the origin of that strain is too much corporate power. What I would add to what Dave said is that we have found ourselves in our communities facing an economic crunch that is now being unmet by our government. Why? There was a financial crisis in 2008. Does everybody here remember it?
Yes.
Well, do you know that now the financial sector is larger than it was then? That's incredible to me. And what this question alluded to that I think was touchy and dark, but that needs addressing, is there was a Democratic Party role in some of this. We bailed out the big banks, but we did not bail out the working people of America. And that is something that we have to face as a party and get right. We have to break up these big banks. We have to break up Goldman Sachs. We have to break up banks that now control an enormous part, about 60% of our GDP. That's the 6 largest banks in the United States. We have to end that domination of our economy and go from corporate power to people power. Reinstate Glass-Steagall. Take the steps that we need to make sure that Dodd-Frank is not eviscerated. Put a tax on transactions that are being made to end this ceaseless speculation, and start making sure that working people's salaries are the way we measure our economy, not the stock market's meaningless rise for people here. Thank you.
And the third person on this question will be Mr. Flynn.
Thank you. It's almost as if the Republicans have forgotten how economics work. If you want to grow the economy, you have to take money from capital and put it into the hands of workers. What this tax bill did is it took roughly $1 trillion and put it into the hands of shareholders and investors, a third of whom are foreigners. So we borrowed from our children to give $300 billion away to sheiks and oligarchs. I would propose that $1 trillion could be put forward in two important ways that would have generated the economy rather than shrinking the economy. Number one, I would have invested in jobs here in America. I would have invested in health care. Medicare for all creates jobs. The Affordable Care Act created 500,000 jobs. Second, invest in renewables, which create jobs 12 times faster than any other sector. And the third thing I would do is I would do debt forgiveness, because we have children, adults now, with $1.4 trillion worth of debt. If we actually relieved them of that debt, that money would go back into the economy. That's how you grow the economy. I've been able to create 400 jobs here in America because I invested in our workforce and trained them for the jobs that we have today. At my company, my average worker's pay has gone up by 40% because we invested in the employees and trained them for the jobs that exist today. We have to stop throwing the money away at corporations and invest in the workforce if we want to grow this economy. Thank you.
All right, moving on to the next question, which stays, however, on the issue of money, and it is the following. It goes to Mr. Rhodes. What is your point of view on the current and projected level of defense spending?
Right now, here in America, we spend as much money on our military as the next 7 nations combined. And as you will hear throughout tonight, you will hear about many policy solutions that many of us on this stage have for America. Medicare for all, fixing the student debt crisis. These issues are things that we could do if we hadn't spent $6 trillion on the war in Iraq. We have to get our defense budget under control. We have to modernize our defense budget so we're not spending so much money overseas instead of on our roads and bridges right here in upstate New York. And until we do that, we're never gonna be able to invest in the many domestic priorities we have here. I'll give you an example. The student debt crisis in America today is $1.4 trillion. The tax bill that just passed was $1.5 trillion. When we talk about these problems, the ways to fund them, we have the money, we have the resources, we're just not spending it here in America. So as a member of Congress, I'll do everything that I can to move our money away from the military-industrial complex and bring it back here to communities in America, communities where if we invested in a real infrastructure plan, think of the effect it will have here in New York 19. Our pipes, our sewer systems are some of the oldest in the United States. So our local towns like Pawling, are being forced to spend money on bonds, which are on the backs of the local taxpayers, continuing to raise the property tax rates, which, as we know here, are already far too high, forcing more senior citizens and young people out of our community. If there was a real federal infrastructure bill, which we could pay for if we weren't investing so much money in our military, we would be able to protect the local taxpayer and keep that money here in America. And that's what I will do as a member of Congress.
Thank you. Okay, speaking next to the question of point of view on current and projected level of defense spending will be Mr. Delgado.
Yes, I think when it comes to our military, it's important to keep one principle in mind, and that is that we are at our best when we project our values, not our power. Our values is what makes us incredibly strong. And what we do to ensure that matters, and our values must be defended. We certainly need to maintain our leadership role around the world, whether it's dealing with climate change, whether it's dealing with the threat of terrorism, whether it's providing humanitarian aid. These are all things that we must be on the march and be focused on. But like any government spending, we must be smart about it, and that includes the military. The Pentagon had a study not too long ago that found, it was not released by the Pentagon, it was leaked, that $125 billion of administrative waste within our DOD on an annual basis. That is a quarter of the current budget. We could be smarter about how we spend our money and invest in future conflicts and not invest or plan for future or past conflicts. And this only gets exacerbated when you have a tax bill that literally adds $1 trillion to the deficit and forces us to make tough decisions, like making sure that our military servicemen and women are provided and paid, at the same time thinking about how we can invest in things like infrastructure and Medicare and our education. We should not be put in this situation when we put our values first and make sure that working families are provided for.
Thanks. Okay, speaking third and last to the question of defense spending, Mr. Clegg.
As a congressman, I would start off by taking back Congress war powers. Right now, we have an authorization to use military force that was created 3 days after 9/11, and we're still allowing a president who's unstable to control our war powers. We need to take that back. We need to make sure that we're not in endless wars without any plan as to how we're going to win, without any plan as to how we're going to get out. We need to get out of Afghanistan. We shouldn't be in Syria. We need to stop using militarism. We need to start using diplomacy. We need to fund the State Department, not the Pentagon. They're adding $100 billion that the Pentagon wasn't even asking for, adding that to the military budget. Why? We're creating armament systems that are ineffective and aren't working, and we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on wasted military spending. We have to change all that. Obviously, as we've talked about, we can redirect that money in ways that would make us stronger, that would allow us to use diplomatic means and use our all the countries in the world that can join together and stop things like what's going on in North Korea. Let's use our military only in a defensive posture. Let's be smart about using our Pentagon. Let's be smart about military force. Let's seek peace as opposed to militarism. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to shift now. I think most communities in the United States care a great deal about education, and one of the questions that came to us was, in fact, about that topic. So going to Mr. Beals first, how do you feel about federal government regulation of education, including private and charter schools?
We have to be investing in education. It's the future of our country, and it's the basis of my life. I am a teacher in our community. We have to, when you ask me about this topic, the first thing that comes to mind is the way in which our government is being dismantled before our eyes by corporate interests that essentially see our budget as some giant pot of loot that they can extract wealth from, instead of the very reason that we came together to form a government in the first place. We formed a government to empower us, to protect us, to provide for the next generation. We're failing to do that. The charter school movement is something I oppose. I see it as a way in which we take money from our public school budget instead of funding it, instead of building up those public schools. The same applies to higher education. I believe that we have to make education tuition-free and make students graduate debt-free. I'm a teacher of a group of high school seniors this year, and it is a shocking thing to look at young people who have everything ahead of them in life and see that they are pessimistic about their own future. They know they are going to be saddled with student debt that is going to be the equivalent of a house in mortgage payments that they have no house for and can never get out from under. And they're looking at this and feeling that the job market is not going to answer their concerns either. There's a simple answer to this problem. Education has to be our number one priority, not our last. Putting a new generation first has to be our top priority, not our last. I'm sure I'm not the only person here who's observed that the average age in this room is is elevated. It is not my it is not my high school classroom. This is nothing against y'all. You're the saviors of our democracy. But it is a statement about where things have gone in our politics. A lot of those young people are working jobs right now, and they probably can't come here. They don't have the leisure time. They can't even follow our politics because they're either disillusioned, disaffected, or overwhelmed or overworked. Well, we can solve this crisis. We can easily as a country, provide for the education of our young people. My parents graduated debt-free in another era. I bet you a lot of people in this room were able to go to school for reasonable payments and emerge without being saddled by that debt. But the truth right now is that student loan debt is a vast source of money, and it is actually being profited on by the federal government. We have to cut those interest rates, start providing debt relief, and yes, debt forgiveness for these young people, because they are our future, and right now we're mortgaging it when we don't actually put them as our priority. Thank you.
That was very politic on age.
I love y'all.
To remind you again, the question is, how do you feel about federal government regulation of education, including private and charter schools? And the second person to speak to this will be Mr. Flynn, if you will.
We have to support and enhance public education and protect it from any talk of vouchers and charter schools. Anybody who lives in the 19th Congressional District, I live in Greene County. My daughter goes to the public school, and there are 18 kids in her grade. Any talk about school choice or charters is ridiculous for those of us who live in small towns and rural communities. When I saw the attack on public education years ago, my wife and I helped start a specialized public high school, but we did it in collaboration with the teachers union, not against them. We can innovate, we can do it together, but we don't work against each other. When we look at higher education, Pell Grants used to cover 85% of the costs at SUNY New Paltz. Today, those Pell Grants would cover less than half the cost. And 56% of the kids who go to four-year colleges never finish. We have to start talking and having a real conversation about what type of education system that we need today. We need to reimagine and rethink what it is that would work. We need to have schools that train people for the jobs that exist today. There are some great programs in our communities right now where people are going to a 6-year program starting in 9th grade and coming out after 2 years of college with an associate's degree and getting a good paying job that's like an apprenticeship. That's how we have to rethink and reinvent our approach to higher education. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We move to our, thank you. Mr. Rhodes, I apologize, if you'll speak to the question of federal regulation of education.
Who here in this room is a public school teacher? A few hands? What I believe, or retire, what I believe is...
We need you to go back to work.
Maybe.
Sorry.
What I believe...
Please.
The federal government should not be telling you what to do in the classroom. We don't need bureaucrats in Washington telling you what textbook to use, telling you what test to use. To restore education, we have to focus back on the classrooms and on our local teachers and give our local schools control over the curriculums and how to run their classrooms, because the teachers are the ones that know best. Now, I wouldn't be here on this stage today without Pell Grants. I am a graduate of the public school system right here in NY19. And what I see today in America is we have two very separate education systems. Whereas education is supposed to be the great equalizer, we now have two education systems. Instead of investing in the public education system and supporting our public school teachers and public schools, we now have created a private school and a charter school system that only certain families, unlike mine, have access to. We have to turn that entire system around, where we reinvest in our public schools, make sure that no matter what zip code you're born into, you will have the same opportunities and access in America, no matter where you're born and where you're raised. And that's what I will fight for in Washington.
Thank you. All right. For Mr. Delgado, if you'll start us off with the fourth question. The federal government recently increased import tariffs on solar panels and washing machines in order to protect U.S. jobs. Are you okay with these types of tariff used to protect and increase U.S. manufacturing jobs?
No, I'm not, particularly when, as I've talked to many solar manufacturers, we know that this is an economy that is growing at 17 times the rate of our overall economy. What we need to be doing to create jobs right here at home, manufacturing jobs right here at home, is to stop propping up the fossil fuel industry to the tune of $4 billion a year. That's what we need to be doing. If we take those tax credits and subsidies that are essentially fueling, forgive the pun, companies like Exxon, and use those monies to invest and incentivize investment, I should say, in solar, in wind, in geothermal, we can create jobs. That's how you do it. That's what's required right now, is moving away from our corporate welfare system to a system that is geared towards working families, geared towards industries that we know real economic growth is there and thriving. We see this not just in the renewable energy space. We can see this in the space of moving from investing in infrastructure, from broadband to roads to rail. All these things can be produced or created in the environment where we actually stop propping up big corporations and propping up industries. Now, a lot of this also lies in this notion, unfortunately, that we don't have to worry about climate change either. Somehow the fossil fuel industry has convinced folk that to protect the environment means you lose jobs. When you fight for clean air or clean water or require that folks not pollute the water or the air, that somehow you lose jobs. We have to bust through this myth, because the reality is those two things are not at odds. In fact, the way forward, the way to protect our environment, the way to ensure that our children can breathe clean air and drink clean water is to move to a green-based economy. That is how we make the transition while creating jobs at the same time. So the question should not be, the question was fine, but the question, the way we're framing how we create manufacturing jobs shouldn't be how we go ahead and tax solar or add tariffs. But the question should be how we make sure we get away from a corporate welfare system and use the revenue that we can generate by virtue of that fact by investing in our roads, in our rails, in broadband, in cell service, in regional distribution plants and processing plants for our agricultural community. We have the means to do this. You know how we can get that revenue? Repeal the tax scam. We can start there. Close corporate loopholes. We can start there. Do away with corporate welfare and take that money and give it back to the people so that we can all share in our prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, the question on tariffs on solar panels and washing machines. Mr. Clegg, if you'll speak to that.
Well, I'm all for tariffs on washing machines. I'm thinking, you know, that's no problem. Just kidding. No, and I would join in. Why pick solar panels? Now, I know the industries throughout New York State are not in favor of that. That in fact they think it may hurt the market. And so why are we putting tariffs on solar panels? Now let's look. You can't pick particular industries and create trade wars without hurting other manufacturing in our country. Imports and exports are an important part of our economy. We can't do that on an ad hoc basis without thinking through the consequences. I join Antonio in thinking that the solar panel issue has some insidious purpose behind it. We know that the fossil fuel industry is not paying the cost of its greenhouse gases that they're emitting. We have a climate change crisis in this world. We have greenhouse gas emissions that are now being allowed when we're burning coal and natural gas and oil, and they're not paying the cost of that. One of the suggestions that I have is let's do a carbon tax. Let's do a carbon tax where anything that's generated with fossil fuel, they actually pay the cost to repairing our environment with it. So if you create a carbon tax, there's an incentive not to use that, to use clean energy as opposed to fossil fuels. We have to move to a clean energy environment. The clean energy jobs are, okay, green collar jobs. Thank you.
All right, I'm sure you'll find a way to finish that sentence in another question. Mr. Beals, if you'll close us up on this question.
The tariffs are wrong. They're another example of America not standing up as it must to answer this terrible threat of climate breakdown in our time. The way to answer that threat is to stand up to the fossil fuel industry. We are subsidizing it right now and allowing it to dominate our politics. This is very real to me. I was a United States diplomat. I served overseas, and I saw the fossil fuel industry firsthand in its attempt to dominate our foreign policy, not only in the Middle East and Iraq, but when I came home. Because I was a former U.S. diplomat, I speak Arabic, and I served us in Iraq. And can anybody guess who offered me a job when I left? ExxonMobil. And I said no, I would not work for them. And there weren't a lot of other good options, I must say. But I had to say no. And I came home to our community here, to my family's farm, and I ultimately became the teacher that I am now. And I believe so strongly that we in our community, the Hudson Valley, the Catskills, have to be the voice for the environment in our time. What that specifically means is I'm the only candidate to have taken the off fossil fuels pledge. I think we need to put a moratorium on these projects, including the Cricket Valley Power Station being set up here right now. And we have to move immediately to solar and wind, providing grants for people to insulate their homes and improve energy efficiency here in our community. It'll be a jobs boon for us and the start of what I believe will be a Green New Deal for our country, saving our country right now and our posterity. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, the fifth question circles back a bit to another on foreign policy and defense. And Mr. Flynn, if you'll be the first person to speak to this question. 21% of the federal budget is spent on foreign policy and defense. What areas of the world do you feel should be our top priorities in setting a foreign policy strategy?
Based on my experience, I've learned that it is diplomacy, alliances, and institutions that do the most to protect us and other countries around the world more than any weapon system. That experience is based on more than 30 years of working in counterterrorism and national security, both in Washington and at the United Nations. And I can tell you right now, as you look at the various threats in the world, our strategy should be to project strength, but do it through engagement and diplomacy. What we're seeing now is an isolationism that we saw after World War I that will allow the rise of authoritarianism and fascism around the world. It's already happening. It's happening in Turkey, it's happening in Hungary, it's happening in Russia right now. If the United States disengages with our values, disengages with our economic power, you will see a continued rise of those fascist powers. So the strategy is, let's start from the top. First and foremost, we have been attacked in an act of war by Russia. We need to, as a Congress, force our president to in fact enact those sanctions on Russia so they stop meddling in our elections and other elections around the world. Second, we have to view China as not only a potential adversary, but as a fierce competitor. They are investing $5 trillion to engage around the world, creating the Silk Road once again. $5 trillion investment in worldwide trade so that they can gain their superpower status. And every time they move ahead, we fall further behind, while we disengage and we allow them to take that lead. We need to hold them accountable for their unfair trade practices, and we need to go after them aggressively. We also need to clean up our mess that we helped create in the Middle East. Afghanistan is an important example. Right now, there are 3 different people in Afghanistan that we have to deal with. It's the Pakistanis, the Indians, as well as the Russians. And right now, the Durand Line in Pakistan is why Pakistan is currently funding the Taliban. We have to not isolate Pakistan, we have to figure out a diplomatic solution so they stop funding the Taliban. On the other side of it, we have the Russians funding the Taliban because they're threatened by ISIS and Uzbeki forces. So we need to figure out a diplomatic solution, removing ourselves militarily from Afghanistan. When it comes to the Middle East, overall, we have to stop picking sides and start taking the role as a leader in that area and actually achieving diplomatic solutions as the arbiter, not someone that's taking cheap political shots. Our spending internationally has shifted away from the State Department and away from diplomacy to defense systems. We need to change that focus and reinvest in our leadership position in the world as the world's leading diplomat. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rhodes, would you continue this discussion?
We have to stand with our allies, and particularly in parts of the world where there is various things going on that we should be concerned about. And certainly standing with Israel, making sure we stand with South Korea. And the biggest threat right now in the foreign policy arena, in some ways, is Donald Trump's Twitter account, where he could tweet us into a nuclear war because he's completely out of control. Now, John Faso is going to get on stage when this debate comes up, and he'll say, "I voted to put more money into the military. I am standing up strong for our defense." Well, John Faso sits on the Budget Committee, and Donald Trump proposed a cut of from $40 billion to $28 billion of the State Department budget, 32% cut. If by slashing our State Department budget, we are hurting our allies, we are not investing in diplomacy. By not investing in diplomacy, that's how we get ourselves into these wars overseas. So John Faso's record on this is not a record that he will be able to stand on, because he needs to be standing up and saying he will use his role on the Budget Committee to make sure we're fully funding the State Department and making sure that our allies get the type of diplomatic resources they need so we can avoid going to war in the first place.
Thank you. Again, the question, what areas of the world do you feel should be our top priorities in setting a foreign policy strategy? If Mr. Delgado would finish out that discussion?
Sure. I look at the three areas of real risk for us, and in the top of the list, North Korea. We're talking about a regime that is led by a man that doesn't seem to have reason in his toolkit. And that's a problem, particularly when we know that they have the capacity to reach our shores with a nuclear intercontinental missile. They also have the ability, in the event that we choose to act preemptively, to aim their missiles, as they already are, at South Korea, and not just kill millions of South Koreans, but hundreds of thousands of American soldiers stationed there. That is a grave threat, and to deal with that, we need to do a lot more than just tweet. We need deliberance, we need thoughtfulness, we need a president, and we need a Congress that takes this threat seriously, very much so. The other area are the Middle East and Africa, particularly West Africa, where you see terrorism on the march. It is imperative that we continue to have a presence and work with our allies, not antagonize them, to make sure that we can work collaboratively to figure out how we can get inside these pockets and figure out how to decimate them effectively. The last piece, I think, goes without saying. We're currently under attack right here at home. We were just told by our Central Intelligence community that the 2018 elections will be infiltrated by Russia. That is a problem, and our Congress needs to start acting like it and protect Special Prosecutor Mueller and allow him to do his job.
Thank you. All right, moving to a sixth question, and we're going to try and have each of these individuals be quite specific. Mr. Clegg, the question is, of the plans that have been proposed in Congress to address the opioid epidemic, which ones could you support?
There's legislation pending right now with Representative Kennedy that talks about providing adequate health care and adequate mental health care for the opioid crisis. One of the things we've talked about is Medicare for all. If we had that, obviously we'd have mental health care, medical care, rehabilitative care. We don't have that right now. I've dealt with a medical issue with respect to getting treatment for people who are addicted throughout my career. I was a public defender for 9 years. I represented hundreds of people with addiction. And those people, sometimes I would fight time and time again to get them rehabilitation, and it didn't always work the first time. So what you need to deal with the opioid crisis is wraparound services. Wraparound services means you have adequate access to health care. You have mental health care. You have rehabilitation care. You have support care after you complete rehabilitation. And then you have everybody who is involved in educating and trying to prevent people from getting into that issue to begin with. That is something we have to work on from top to bottom. Now, with Congress, we have to do more. Obviously, I think the president just said he was going to devote $10 or $13 billion, but we haven't seen that. When we take away money that the Congress is not going to be able to use because we have deficit spending, et cetera, I have to see the proof in the pudding. I know we need wraparound services. I know how difficult it is for addicts to recover. I've dealt with people and I've watched them time and time again, and they can get through it. I had one client who I got 2 times where they had rehabilitation, they failed, they got it again. I didn't see them for 20 years. And then at a hospital, when I was visiting someone tapped me on the shoulder, and it was that woman, and she had turned a life around. She was now a nurse. So I know we shouldn't leave anybody behind. It's not easy to cure addiction. We need that support. We need the patience to work with it. The opioid crisis also, obviously, is a product of our pharmaceutical industry. We need to hold them accountable. They're now talking about giving these pills that are crush-proof or something to try and prevent them from using them for the opioid addicts. And yet they're suggesting we still pay the pharmaceutical industry to recovery for the opioid crisis that we have. It's ridiculous. We need to hold them accountable. I know that I was just at a town in Cooperstown, believe it or not, where trial lawyers are now being hired by towns to hold the pharmaceutical industry accountable for the crisis that they've created. And we know that their distribution is something that can't be defended, that a town in West Virginia got 6 million pills. We know that they knew the problem, and they're part of the problem. So let's take them both on, and let's protect the people who are addicted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clegg. Mr. Delgado, would you speak to that question?
I sure would. You know, this is a real epidemic, particularly in this district in upstate New York. Sullivan County, for example, top in terms of overdoses when it comes to opioids. I think we could do this a couple ways. One, we need to criminalize the behavior that led to this, and by that I mean making sure we hold accountable these pharmaceutical industries who knowingly prescribed and overprescribed these addictive, highly addictive drugs. We must hold them accountable to prevent the behavior from happening again. And we must decriminalize the behavior of those who are now suffering as a result. We have Republicans, and Fazo's one of them, who likes to talk a lot about dealing with this issue in a more compassionate and humane way and decriminalizing, and that sounds good, but it's not consistent with a decision to roll back Medicaid expansion, when Medicaid is the very thing that provides the funding for drug treatment centers. So any piece of legislation that would make sure that we expand Medicaid and fund it to the point where it can do its job and fund properly these drug treatment centers and enable us to truly decriminalize this behavior and treat it with the compassion and empathy and love and care that it deserves, that's the kind of legislation that I am for. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rhodes.
Deaths from opioid addiction is now the leading cause of death for Americans under 50. I think last year nearly 64,000 Americans died from this, close to the same numbers of Americans who died in Vietnam. This is a real crisis, and it's affecting our community right here. As I was with a family in Greene County a few weeks ago and talking to the parents who weren't eligible for Medicaid funding, but were going bankrupt. Their families going bankrupt just trying to pay for the treatment. And one bill that I would support would be H.R. 676, make sure we have Medicare for all, and to make sure that our private health insurance companies right now aren't paying for alternative forms of pain treatment. You have rheumatoid arthritis, many private health insurance companies do not cover that. So as a result, doctors are prescribing these cheap opioids, which therein lies the problem where the addiction follows. And over 2 million Americans right now are struggling with opioid addiction. Only 1 million Americans have access to treatment. In the lock zone, we have to make sure that our first responders, the EMTs, our fire departments, this is the #1 thing that they're responding to calls in our community right now. I was a volunteer firefighter. When it was about car accidents and house fires. Now it's about responding to overdoses. We have to make sure that these first responder departments have the resources that they need, and let's high time that the companies that made millions of dollars of peddling these drugs don't make huge profits off of selling the drugs to treat it.
Thank you. Take a sip of water, Mr. Rhodes. You're still up.
Thank you.
Okay, our seventh question. The largest development project in this congressional district is a $1 billion power plant under construction near here that uses natural gas as a fuel as opposed to renewable fuel. But it will employ many workers and reduce property taxes. What is your opinion of this kind of development? Mr. Rhodes.
So the question is about the question about Cricket Valley in the town of Dover. And I want to just begin by saying what's happening coming out of Washington, the entire approach to renewable energy is exactly backwards. Trump has proposed a 72% cut in investments in clean energy. Mr. Faso sits on the budget committee again and has said absolutely nothing about these proposed cuts. I believe that we need the transition to renewable energy, to solar, to wind. It should happen in the Hudson Valley. It should happen across America. I was proud to be part of the administration that said no to fracking here in New York State, and the transition needs to start now. The question is, how do we get there from where we are today? We want to be able to turn the lights on tomorrow, I believe. And so I think we have to just work as hard as we can to make sure the transition happens as quickly as possible. Cricket Valley was an enormous investment here in Dutchess County. I think what we have to focus on is less on not focusing on Cricket Valley, but more on focusing on how we can get to wind and solar here in our community as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Mr. Flynn, do you want to pick that up?
Yes, thank you. We have to stop calling natural gas natural gas. It's methane. And in fact, because of the fugitive gases that release, it's just as dirty as coal. And if we continue to invest in fracking infrastructure, our addiction to it will last for a very long time. So we have to actually pass a revenue-neutral carbon tax that would more accurately reflect the cost to our communities of such large investments in fracking infrastructure. We have to hasten the transition to renewables. We have to look at specific investments in our communities that would make that happen. For example, I have proposed a climate conservation corps. The fastest way to get a return on your money to reduce the amount of fossil fuel that you use is conservation techniques. So we put an army of people together, pay them a decent job and a decent wage, to go out there and implement these techniques. The benefit of that is we will use less fossil fuels, we'll have people that have decent jobs in our communities, and we'll, as I said earlier, we'll be taking money and investing it in our communities. It has a dual purpose. But we keep thinking about the old school way of doing things by building these big power plants and being beholden to fossil fuel industry. If we take those subsidies, that $40 billion that we give the fossil fuel industry, and transition that to renewables, we'll be able to make the investments we'll need. We'll be, in fact, hasten that transition, and we won't any longer expose ourselves to methane. Stop calling it natural gas. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Beals, you're up third on this question.
We have to stop the Cricket Valley plant. That's what we have to do. And you didn't hear that said just now, and that's because we have all of the solutions to these problems, but we don't act on them. We talk about solving the problem of climate change for a long time now, but we're not actually doing anything about it, and the situation is growing dire. And I do not think this is an issue where we can just put forward new ideas and new plans and act like that's a good idea or a good thing when we could have already been acting, and we have to act right now. Now, what are people going to say? The question was good. Hey, what about jobs? Well, I'll tell you about jobs. I've taken the off fossil fuels pledge because we're going to start a Green New Deal in this country, and the largest rising new profession is wind technician. And there are going to be plenty of jobs provided right there. Now you hear people say, well, what are we going to do about taxes? Well, property taxes? Are you serious? First of all, these are being driven up because we've been given incredible tax breaks to millionaires who are not paying into our tax system. We're also having an enormous crunch because of healthcare costs in our country. We're going to pass Medicare for all. We're going to save trillions in our federal budget, and everybody's taxes are finally going to go down. We have the solutions to these problems, but we have to stand up to the big industries and businesses. And I'll add, lastly, that we have to get GE to complete its cleanup of the Hudson River now and stop dancing around it, because they haven't done the job.
Why don't you continue standing? You get to lead off on the 8th question. Thank you. The U.S. currently spends over $3 trillion on health care. What type of legislation might you sponsor to address this issue, if elected? And how would you propose to pay for such a health care solution?
The healthcare crisis is the defining crisis of our time. It's the defining issue of this election, and it's one of the defining issues of my own life. And the solution to it is Medicare for all. We have the legislation. It's House Resolution 676. There are now over 100 Democrats ready to cast their voice for it. There are Senators Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, who have standing up to support this legislation. Not all Democrats have, and all Democrats should and must, and I want to be adding our voice and our vote to that. Now, why do we need to do it so badly? This is the part where I'm supposed to tell a citizen's story, and I could tell the story of a woman I met in Phoenicia who is afraid to go to the doctor even though she told me she feels a mass in her side because she doesn't want to face the bill. She'd rather die than face the bill. There are people dying because of this healthcare crisis. But I can't help but tell a personal story because just over the past 2 weeks, we had a dental bill from my wife who had a tooth infection, and that bill came to $1,200, which we got reduced to $1,000 by calling a special number, but then she had to go in and get a cleaning, and the filling wasn't covered, so that cost another $200, so we were back to the original $1,200. These are crippling costs for working people in the district, of which I am one. And I want to speak for those people and to those costs. The answer to these problems is not to put our heads in the sand any longer. People are living in fear of bankruptcy. People can't afford their care. How are we going to solve this crisis? What does it mean to stand up for Medicare for all in this terrible time? It is very simple. We can easily afford it. There will be instant savings, and the average premium cost that families are going to pay under a Medicare for all system is about $466 a year. You know how much they're paying now? We could do a survey in this room, but it's on the realm of $5,000 for your plan and then another $1,600 out of your pocket for deductibles that you're paying. This is a tremendous strain on our economy, and there's a tremendous industry that wants to see it perpetuated. It's an industry of medical device suppliers. It's an industry of pharmaceuticals. It's an industry of insurers and people receiving gigantic compensation packages. We are paying more than the rest of the world, and we're dying younger. It is crippling our small businesses that can't start up because they're afraid of these costs. It is crippling our young people who are job locked and unable to pursue entrepreneurship or move around in their lives because they're afraid of losing their coverage. And it's hurting our seniors and our working people who themselves are finding their costs and wallets bottomed out, can't spend in the local economy, and can't help our economy and our lives flourish. It's the #1 priority of the 2018 election and for our country and for our party.
Thank you. Mr. Clegg, again, what type of legislation might you sponsor to address this issue of health care, and how would you propose to pay for your solution?
Ditto. So Medicare for all and HR 676, just to be clear, how do you pay for it? Well, one of the ways you pay for it is you negotiate with the pharmaceutical industry, and we don't pay 6 times more for pills that are made here than they pay for it in Canada. So we have billions of dollars that we save right there. Now, we spend 18% of our GDP on healthcare. We can spend less, provide coverage for all with Medicare for all, and have money left over to pay down our national debt. The taxes are going to be such that you're going to tax the bill itself. The 5%, the top 5% are going to have a progressive tax rate. There's going to be employment taxes. Now, as a small businessman, as I said, I provided health care to my employees. I spent tens of thousands of dollars a year for my employees. Most, if not all, small businessmen would save money with a Medicare for All plan. We would save on our property taxes because the Medicaid costs that we pay for now with our property taxes would now be covered by progressive tax and by employment taxes. They say that 95% of the country would pay less for health care if we had Medicare for All. We will spend less, we will get more, and everybody in our country will be provided with not only health care, but nursing home care, mental health care, which we don't provide now. It is essential. It will transform our country. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodness, what was that? A little musical interlude. Mr. Delgado, would you like to speak to the issue of health care?
Absolutely. This is, I agree with Jeff, this is going to be a critical issue in 2018, so much so that the first ad that I took out was against John Fazio's decision, or I should say false promise, to Andrea Mitchell when he looked her in the eyes 3 times and said, "I won't take away your health care," and then turned around and did just that. It's deeper than policy there. It's about your word. And he revealed that he doesn't like to keep his in that situation. It is a shame that of the 33 developed countries in the world, the richest one, the one that is the richest in the world's history, is the only one without some form of universal coverage. It is a chief obscenity of our society, and we absolutely, as Democrats and as progressives, need to change that. The question we must keep in mind is how we do it and what is the most effective way. I would support currently Senator Schatz's bill out of Hawaii that asks or believes, or I should say suggests, that we opt into Medicaid or Medicare. Single payer is an option, and it's one that we should certainly consider. But we also recognize that half of the world, the developed world, has a single payer. The other half has a public option. We call them all universal in nature. So the key should be for us as Democrats to unify around one objective, and one objective only: universal coverage. If we can unify around that, we will secure the victory. We will drive down the cost of premiums and deductibles. We will get Medicare to negotiate drug prices with the pharmaceutical industry. Keep that in mind. Universal coverage.
Thank you. And you're going to be up at the beginning of the 9th question, so draw a breath.
I want to stand up.
Go for it. Go for it. Is cutting
All right.
All right. Is cutting budget deficits a high priority for you? And if so, what would you cut?
Oh, this feels
And
better.
what would you tax? What would you cut and what would you tax to reduce the deficit?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part. You said I heard.
Okay, is cutting budget deficits a high priority for you? And if so, what would you cut or what would you tax to reduce the deficit?
You know, Republicans used to be, or at least they call themselves, the party of fiscal responsibility. Is my mic on? Okay. They've certainly abandoned that by virtue of the tax scam, right? When you vote for a bill that adds over $1 trillion to our deficit, and it's forced us right now to have to borrow $1 trillion in 2018 at a rate that is beyond what we've seen in decades, we are putting ourselves and burying our future in mountains of debt. Now, in terms of cutting, what we can cut, I think I've alluded to this earlier. We have $125 billion of administrative waste right now when it comes to our Pentagon. I wouldn't even call that cutting. It's not really cutting. It's just spending more wisely. That's what it is. It's not cutting anything. It's about making sure that we use our resources and spend more wise. If we do that, we can get in the right direction on this way. I think, but more than cutting, though, what we got to do is take from the folks who are keeping money out of our hands and not allowing us to share in the prosperity. The fact that we have corporations who've been just given a 15% corporate tax break and essentially given a blank check with no contingency, no condition to take the revenues that they generate by virtue of that tax break and invest it in job creation, invest it in increased wages. We're still being asked to buy into this failed economic theory called trickle-down economics. It's been proven wrong and broken, and it's immoral. And we have to get to a point now where we understand that the only way we can have opportunity in this country is to have it bubble up from the ground up. Real investment in our infrastructure, real investment in our young people, in our educational system, real investment in our workforce by training them to take on the jobs that are available to them. That's what we have to do to create opportunity. And we can spend that money by making sure that people pay their fair share, that corporations pay their fair share. We can't do this if we say to the top 1%, you know what? Even though you got billions of dollars, we're going to just go ahead and lower that rate for you one more time. What is the point of doing that? The only point to do that is to keep feeding greed. And I'm tired of this greed that is infecting our democracy and undermining our inequality, our equality, to no end. And so we can talk about cutting. That's important. But we should also focus on what we can do to make sure that we can share in our prosperity. Instead of talking about a corporation rate and dropping it 15%, how about we first make sure that they actually pay what they've been obligated to pay in the first place? They've been paying that 35% rate for decades. So dropping it down to 21% doesn't really accomplish anything if the average marginal rate they were paying in the first place was 18% due to tax credits and due to subsidies. So we have to make sure that we do the work when it comes to to ensure that corporations pay their fair share and that the wealthy pay their fair share.
Thank you. Mr. Rhodes, standing up or sitting down?
I can try to stand up, but let's see what the mic does.
Don't fall off the stage.
I'll do my best.
All right. You remember the question?
Can you give it one more time?
Okay. Is cutting budget deficits a high priority for you? And if so, what would you cut or what would you tax to reduce the deficit?
Let's remember when John Faso ran for this seat in 2016, not that long ago, he said his number one priority was the federal deficit and the federal debt. That was his number one priority, and that's why he wanted to serve on the Budget Committee. So let's look at what's happened since John Faso and his party has been in power. The 2019 projected federal deficit was, before Faso took office, $600 billion. Today, $1.2 trillion. It has doubled under John Faso's watch. So either he is completely ineffective or he's complicit. He has to pick one of those two. My generation has so much invested in this because this is a can that we cannot kick down the road because we are kicking it to ourselves. By 2037, Social Security will be unable to pay out its obligations. By 2027, we'll be paying more on our debt service in America than we will be on discretionary spending. These are issues that we cannot keep punting on, and that's why we need new people in office who are actually invested in this so we can finally solve these problems. Let's make sure that let's raise the cap on Social Security so everyone pays into the system fairly so we can protect it. We have over 40,000 millionaires in America that get Social Security benefits. The average wealth of a member of Congress today is $1 million, 18 times the average income of a family here in New York 19. Let's send more working class people to Congress who can stand up and fight for these issues.
Thank you. Mr. Flynn, number 3 on the question of deficits and how you'd address it.
The way you deal with deficits is you grow the economy. And the way you grow the economy is you can put people to work and increase their wages. That's why my entire campaign is about a plan for the American worker. What we've learned with this Republican administration is that they plan to take money out of the economy and put it to capital. I want to take money and put it into the economy and invest it in creating jobs that will grow the economy and will create more revenue in the future. We also have to, as Gareth mentioned, we have to raise the limit so that we can fund Social Security, but we also have to reform corporate taxes so they actually pay the fair share. The Fortune 500 pays 14.4% average tax rate before we put this tax bill into place. We also have to tax earned income at a lower level than unearned income. If you didn't earn your income, I think you should pay a higher tax rate than if you actually worked for it. And if we actually put people to work and start growing the economy, that's the way we're going to actually get out of this deficit. The problem is we're fighting against Republicans who keep thinking, let's take the money out and give it away to capital. And what we're talking about here today is take that money and put it towards creating jobs in renewable energy, in healthcare, in new industries, and training kids for the people in the jobs that exist today. I'm the only person on this stage who's created blue-collar American jobs. 70% of Americans don't have a college degree. That's where we need to invest to grow this economy. Thank you.
Why don't you remain standing, if you will, and you start off on our 10th and last question. We had yet another gun shooting tragedy in Florida recently. And again, there appears to be no concrete action by our Congress. Can you comment on proposals that have emerged after the tragedy to ban assault rifles and to require universal background checks and universal registration of all guns, including handguns and shotguns?
Gun safety is going to come from courage and political will. That is how we're going to reduce gun violence. We have to not be afraid to talk about it. This moment that we have here today, that feels a little bit about like the Me Too moment, where people are finally paying attention to gun violence, this moment is decades late. Too many people died. Do you know that the day after that mass shooting where 17 young people were killed, 90 people in America died from gun death? 9-0. It's not just the mass shootings. It's an entire epidemic that we have in this country. So the solution to this is starting a conversation. 90% of gun owners aren't in the NRA. Now, I live in Greene County, and we don't go into the woods to go hunting. We go into the backyard to go hunting. It's part of the gun culture. None of my neighbors have AR-15s. None of them think they should. I've talked to them about it. And they don't understand why it is we can't get together on this. Why we can't come together as a nation to take on the special interests that control this debate. So let's start with the solution. First and foremost, get money out of politics. Donald Trump received $30 million from the NRA. $17 million went to other GOP people. And our competitor, John Faso, he received $40,000. First thing, get money out of politics, and they won't be beholden to them. Second thing is, 94% of Americans believe in universal background checks and closing the gun show loopholes and the internet loopholes. Let's close them. Third thing is, let's keep weapons of war out of the hands of civilians. My brother was killed by a weapon of mass destruction, Semtex. It's a plastic explosive. It's no longer available. You can't go buy it at a Walmart. So when I talk to gun owners about it, I tell them about the experience I've had by having my brother killed by a weapon of mass destruction. Other families shouldn't have to go through the same thing. So let's get those guns, those weapons of war, out of the hands of civilians. And by the way, don't be fooled. This isn't a mental health issue. There's no drug that could have been prescribed to stop that shooter in Las Vegas or stop that shooter in Florida. I spoke to the head of psychiatry at Bassett, and she was apoplectic, which I think might actually be a technical term for her condition. She was apoplectic at the idea that the president and the NRA keep saying it's a failure of the mental health industry. We have to fight against that because that's not what this is about. This is a failure of access. We shouldn't have allowed them to do that. And the last thing is, and this is really important, we have a Dickey Amendment that was passed by Congressman Dickey that doesn't allow us to get data and information on gun-related deaths. We need to repeal that amendment so we can use real facts and real data in order to understand what is causing this. That's how we'll lead this fight. We cannot give up, and we have to take this. Now is the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Beals.
We have the majority to take the action we need to do on gun violence and end this terrible epidemic right now. And our Congressman, John Faso, has blood on his hands for not acting. And we must never let him off the hook for that and never stop telling him what he has done by failing us to take action and by taking this money from the NRA, which is absolutely blood money. And I'll add as a teacher here that we're traumatizing an entire generation of young people right now. We have in my school active shooter drills, and again, I'm going to do another one of these lines about the elevated age of the audience, but some of you grew up in the duck and cover generation, perhaps, okay? The duck and cover thing, nuclear war didn't happen, okay? And that was memorable enough. But when I crowd my students into a bathroom and tell them to remain silent while we turn the lights off, in a country where mass shootings have become a regular incident, That is something very memorable and very real to them, and it is something we should not be allowing to happen in the lives of young people. The root of this problem is the root of so many problems we have. It's corporate power. There are giant majorities of gun owners and non-gun owners alike, and I count myself among the gun owners. We have them on our family farm. We know a gun can be a tool. We have hunting. We have hunters. Everything is copacetic. But what is not copacetic and not right is a collusion of gun manufacturers and their money who want to sell more weapons and thus prevent any sensible legislation from being taken. Let's take the legislation and do it on the basis of a new majority.
Thank you. Mr. Clegg.
We have an epidemic in our country, and that epidemic is being spread by the NRA, the gun lobby, the gun manufacturers, and the Republican Congress. It is shameful. Our children are not being protected. They look to us and say, how can you not protect us? The gun lobby is there and effective only because they are able to give millions of dollars to politicians. They are able to get politicians in our Republican Congress to decide that the CDC cannot investigate and study gun violence, that we're not even allowed to discover what we can do to interrupt this gun violence that is an epidemic and is killing people throughout our country. 30,000 people died from gun violence last year. A person dies from gun violence every 15 minutes. The AR-15 is a weapon of mass destruction. It is a killing machine. Its bullets are designed to kill. That is the only reason to have that gun. There is no reason that anybody needs to have that gun. But you do need courage. You need courage to at least stand up and protect our children, at least stand up from a public health standpoint. Let us stop this massacre that's going on in our country. No other civilized country in the world comes close to this. Let's do something about it. Thank you.
Indeed. Before we begin with the closing statements from each of these gentlemen, I'd like everybody to just take a breath for a moment after that extremely necessary and sober question. And just, Paul, maybe let's clarify so that everybody knows. The candidates will be going for signatures, necessary signatures.
Yes.
And so if you know the timeline.
At the conclusion of the debate, first off, I'd like you all to stop in our own little spin room where you can get a cookie and a couple other things and meet the candidates. They'll all be staying after the closing statements, and I'd hope you all might be able to get a chance to talk to them. Starting on March the 5th, the candidates will be circulating petitions to become on the ballot. On the ballot will be for the June 26th primary, where all 5 candidates and Mr. Ryan will appear, and at that point you'll be voting among the candidates. But I hope all of you will be able to become involved in that process or involved with either a candidate or with your own town committees. Representatives of your town committees are here tonight, and it's very important that you not only attend tonight, but that you listen carefully to the candidates and stay involved, either with their campaigns or with the Democratic Party as we move forward. They'll go into their closing statements here in a moment, but I hope that you'll be able to stay involved, meet them all a little bit more personally in our little spin room over there, and help them get signature on petitions starting on March 5th.
And can you just say a word about where the petitions will be?
Sure. The petitions will be prepared by each of the campaigns. They need to get approximately 1,250 signatures from within the 11 counties that make up the 19th Congressional District. Each one of them will try to get far more than 1,250 because there's technical reasons why the election laws will go on like that and so forth. So it's a daunting job. It's an important job to make sure that they get out and meet voters and get enough signatures each so that everybody has the right choice to make on June 26th.
Okay. All right. So we're going to go in reverse order from how we opened. And each of our candidates will have 3 minutes to make a closing statement. And so going in reverse order, Mr. Beals is first.
We're gathered here, and I'm so thrilled that you're all here, because we have a crisis in our democracy. Our democracy is in the balance in this election, and the future of our Democratic Party is in the balance as well. We have to stand up to John Faso, and I have stepped out of my classroom and onto this stage in order to do just that for our community. I'm doing it because I believe that the answers we need and the answers that we can enact to our problems are here. It's not a question of coming up with your brilliant new set of ideas. It's a question of having the gumption to finally act on them as a party and as a country. If you all want to see our health industry stood up to and health care provided as a right to all Americans, then enact Medicare for all now. Stand up and do it. Not all people are prepared to do that, even those on the stage. If you want to see us face climate breakdown and ensure that we will not see wars overseas like I've seen, and ensure that we will not see degradation of our own farms as I've seen on mine and as I've seen traveling our district, then stand up to the fossil fuel industry right now. Take the off fossil fuel pledge, as I have done, and take action immediately on a Green New Deal. People will talk about it, but they won't all act on it, and we must. If you want to see the opioid crisis that's ravaging our communities stopped, then take action now to face down Purdue Pharmaceuticals, who are actively marketing these drugs and more addictive opioids to our young people, and open up the laws so they can be sued for these practices. And don't be scared about calling them out by name. If you want to see us take action on income inequality, face down the big banks right now. Break them up, because we have to reimpose Glass-Steagall and change our financial sector. People will talk about it, but they won't actually take action and do it. If you believe in being pro-choice, don't pay lip service to it like John Faso does, and then go and vote to defund Planned Parenthood. Take the action now. And if you believe that our country has grown too militaristic, as I do, as somebody who's a former U.S. diplomat, then stand up right now to this Defense Department budget and actually cut it, and actually dare to fund our diplomats, fund our diplomacy, make sure Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons, put us in the Paris peace agreement, and put forward a visionary solution for the Israelis and the Palestinians. And if you want big dollars out of government, then stand up with a grassroots campaign that is actually doing it, not just talking about it. We've been endorsed by the Justice Democrats. That's the national group of former Bernie Sanders staffers who have stood up for campaigns that stand for people's values. We've also been supported by Hillary Clinton supporters across our district, because I voted Bernie and then I served on Hillary Clinton's foreign policy team. I believe that we can all come together at this pivotal moment for our democracy to run a grassroots campaign that is a true contrast to John Faso. When we do it, we'll beat him, and we'll save our country in the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rhodes.
Well, first, thank you, Jill. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Bill and Helen and the rest of the Pawling Democrats for organizing this today. And I didn't get a chance to talk about the on the gun question, but I want to get that a little bit in my beginning of my closing statement. Who here today? Did anyone here today watch the town hall this past week on CNN, where all those students down in Texas, in Florida? It was an incredible and moving experience. You had an entire gymnasium full of teenagers, high school students, standing up, and there was Marco Rubio on the stage, and they actually made him rethink some of his policies on gun safety laws, because these were high school students. It took 14 and 15-year-olds to make a sitting Republican U.S. Senator change their positions. I was thinking if you only lowered the voting age to about 12, there'd be a lot of people in Congress who would not have a job right now. But that is where I believe that we need to go as a nation. We need a new generation of leaders to stand up, and these are big problems, and these are going to take big solutions. After the town hall had ended, I remember watching on TV, there was a father from Columbine on TV on the panel, and he said, maybe this is the crisis. Maybe this is the crisis where we get this right. 19 years later, Columbine's not even in the top 10 anymore of school shootings. That's how bad it's become. We need to send people to Congress who are personally invested in these outcomes. I believe in single-payer health care because I've lived without health insurance. I know the struggles and the anxieties of not knowing what would happen if something went wrong. I believe in supporting our public schools and our public school teachers and public higher education, because I would not be standing here in front of you tonight without that here in our community. I believe in standing up for our climate and our environment because I grew up in the district of the Hudson River, grew up hiking in the Catskill Mountains. These issues are personal to me, and that's why I'm running against John Faso, because I can't wait to face him on this stage this November. Here was a man who served in the state assembly, then used that government experience to make millions of dollars as a lobbyist, and now is going to Congress, has turned his back on our community, because when he leaves, which he will this November, he knows he'll go out and make even more money off of us. I'm running because not just to win this seat now, let's keep this seat even when it's not a blue wave. That's why I'm going to every single town in this community as part of my campaign, all 163. If you're not in Pawling, I hope to see you in your town. And I'm going to do that every single year once in office. So you can hold me accountable for my votes, so I can keep listening to you, hearing your issues and your ideas, and most importantly, bring your voices to Washington, D.C. So again, thank you so much for having us, and I hope to earn your support.
Thank you. Mr. Clegg.
I also want to extend my personal thanks for all of you who came here tonight on a dark, stormy night. It's something, as we talk about, it gives us hope. We think we can win this. We can win this because of all of you. Now, we are in a fight. We are in a fight for the soul of America. Donald Trump is trampling on our democracy. And the Republican Congress, along with John Faso, are not only standing by mute, they are complicit and they are cooperating with undermining our rule of law in this country. Donald Trump, as he attacks the FBI, the Justice Department, the judiciary, our free press, all the pillars of our democracy. As he does that, they stand mute and support him. We have to fight against it. I am coming into this because I believe we have to have somebody who's got the ability and the experience and the record of success standing up to powerful forces. That's what I've done. Whether it's Walmart or Wall Street firms or multinational corporations, I've fought those battles. There's a lot of talk about taking on corporations and predatory conduct. Well, I've been doing it for 35 years. And I've been successful time and time again doing it, working for working class folks, our families, our neighbors, our friends, and taking on the biggest corporations in the world. And I've done it time and time again. So I want to bring that to Congress. And I'm doing this in a way that I can tell you that I am only beholden to you. I will never be beholden to special interests. The fundraising that I'm doing is only with low donor contributions, contributions from people who are my friends, contributions from people who believe in me, not from any corporations. And when I say corporations, I mean corporate executives or Wall Street investors or people with a hedge fund background or people with some kind of ulterior motive to why they're taking my money. When you come to me, and if you want somebody who's going to defend you and represent only you and stand up to the tough people, the big money, the dark money out there, then I'm your guy. If you want somebody who will only listen to you and will be there and not beholden to any special interests, then I'm your guy. If you want somebody who's been local, who's given back to our community, who you know who I am by what I've done, then I'm your guy. I love this community. I've been here. I've raised my family here. My wife taught in school here. I've worked in the community in many ways, and I'm going to continue to do that and raise that service to a higher level to represent all of you in Congress. I humbly ask for your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Delgado.
Thank you all for coming out this evening. Really enjoyed the exchange. We have to win. Period. We can't hope. We can't, pray. Well, we can pray, but we can pray. My mom would tell me we better pray. So we can pray. Sorry, Mom. But we need to win. You're looking at the candidate who can win. The candidate who can beat John Faso is a candidate that can outwork him, that can raise the money to compete against him, that can organize in a way that will drown him out and that can inspire genuine turnout. I can do all of those things. I can outwork him because I come from working class folk. I can outwork him because my parents told me since I was yay high, you will have to work twice as hard to get ahead. And I did. And I've been doing it ever since. It's why I've been able to achieve what I've been able to achieve in my life. I've been proving that work ethic day in and day out. I've used that work ethic to raise money. I'm the only candidate on this stage that outraised John Faso every single quarter in 2017 with nearly $1.5 million raised, and not a cent, not a dollar has come from a corporation or a corporate PAC. It's come from people that I and my team and my wife have worked diligently and doggedly to ask for money to say, listen, we need to take this thing back. I have raised the most money in small dollar donations. So it's not just about big dollars. It's about grassroots dollars too. We're doing it all. And we're going to take that money. And we're going to go all across this district and build a world-class field organization with satellite offices, with hundreds and hundreds and thousands of volunteers, disseminating a message of hope, a message of change, a message grounded in our working class roots and our values, like integrity, like compassion, and like service. That's what we need right now. Work ethic, the money to get the information and the message out, the organization, and critically, the ability to inspire. The ability to speak from a place of authenticity, the ability to get beyond the politics and speak to people's hearts, to remind people this is deeper than politics. It's about morality. That's what it's about. It's about who we fundamentally are at this critical moment in our history. We are deeper than politics. We are about truth. We are about service. We are about compassion. We are about character. And right now, all of that is under siege. I'm here to fight with you, tooth and nail, all the way across the finish line. And we will win. We will win. And with that, I ask for your support. Thank you.
Mr. Delgado, thank you. And our last speaker for this session and for the evening is Mr. Flynn.
Thank you all for coming tonight on what you call a dark and stormy night. Where my people come from, we call it a fine soft rain. Listen, we all know our country is in trouble, and we all know that people have been in economic pain for a long time. And we know that Donald Trump exploited that to divide us. Look, I know I'm the right candidate for this seat at this time. I'm the only candidate on this stage who's created hundreds of blue-collar American jobs. I'm the only candidate on this stage who's been to Washington and got legislation passed. I'm a true progressive Democrat who's been advocating for Medicare for all since 2004. And I'm the only one on this stage with a plan to move us forward. But I'm the right candidate not just because of what I've done, but more importantly, because of what I've learned by doing it. I've learned that when ordinary people come together around a common cause, they can accomplish extraordinary things against impossible odds. When my brother was killed in the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, like those kids down in Florida, I was just a teenager. But from that moment, everything changed. Together, my family and the other victim family took on the big corporations. We took on the special interest. We took on our own government and demanded justice, and we didn't stop until we won. Coming together, not apart. That's the American ideal. It's that seemingly impossible goal of becoming truly indivisible. Donald Trump, Paul Ryan, John Faso, they've used income inequality and despair to fuel division. They've passed legislation to help their rich donors and friends while playing on our worries and our fears and pitting us against one another. I say, no more. Like those students down in Florida, like women around the world, like the students in Charlottesville, let's join together. Let's join together and fight for economic justice. Let's solve the real problem and take away the fuel of division. That's how we'll solve the pressing problems that we discussed tonight, together.
see, our job as people in this room, as Democrats, as Americans, is to come together to end disparity, to bring economic justice, so that Americans don't just survive, but thrive. Because that's the promise of America, where everyone and anyone can thrive. Join us. Join in our campaign, and together, let's build an America that works for all of us. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very, very much on behalf of everybody. Was your great uncle really Mike Quill?
Yes, he was. Of course he was. That's why I'm still eating him out.
Oh.